greetings to all. This is Abhivardhan from the Bharat Pacific, and with Aditya, we are here for another interesting interview with Mohammad Soliman from the Middle East Institute. I'd like to introduce our guest because this is one of the very special interviews which we are having, and I guess this would comprise a lot of interesting horizons which are happening in West Asia, and I guess the discussion would be really enriching for all the viewers because um, we'd like to come up with more nuanced and I would say even emerging perspectives on West Asia and even those on the critical technologies front. So let me introduce our speaker and then we can go ahead with the session. Mohammad Soliman is the director of Strategic Technology and Cybersecurity Program at the Middle East Institute. Uh, his work focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in Middle East and North Africa. Uh, his one work which fascinated me a lot was about this concept of an Indo-Abrahamic Accord when the I2U2 grouping was actually kind of introduced by the relevant leaders and government members from Israel, India, UAE, and the United States. And his work on Indo-Abrahamic relations, in the sense that Indo-West Asian countries relations, is something which fascinated me a lot. So uh, I was thinking that maybe an interactive discussion on this could be, really insightful for all of us. So welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate being on the podcast with you. I really followed your work and the great discussions we had with previous speakers. So I'm very, very looking forward to this.
Thank you so much. So let's start with some basic questions. Um, when we talk about the India-West Asia relationships, we are talking about a bunch of countries which are very unique in their own conditions, right? I mean, we are way past the Cold War dilemma, so we are considering countries like Israel, Palestine, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, right? So when we look at these countries, a lot of interesting developments have happened in the past 2 years, which have kind of shaped the dynamic, when it comes to the India relationship. So my question is that when we look at the dynamic relationship, how do you see the aftermath of whatsoever was achieved through the Abraham Accords? Because I think the Abraham Accords kind of ushered a new anchor of cooperation amongst certain West Asian countries, and India was kind of very much elated about it. So how do you see that? I think we can take that as a cornerstone to begin with.
Now, that's an excellent question. I can start by saying that the Abrahamic Accords, the peace agreements that the Trump administration signed or sponsored between Israel, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, you can also include Sudan to this a bit. I would say it formalized an existing relationship between Israel and these mentioned countries. It much more codified an existing relationship than coming up with something new. However, having a formalized relationship, having ambassadors residing in their respective capitals, having some sort of a platform for bilateral relationship that's public, provides opportunities to coordinate diplomatic, economic, and political fronts. And I would say that the relationship between the UAE and Israel right now is at the highest point of cooperation, and something that we didn't really see in West Asia in a long time. To your second part of the question about India, uh, 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 there was a lot of questions. There are a lot of concerns about the Abrahamic Accords and if they will endure after the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. People were not really sure, even here in DC. People were not really sure if this would be if there would be some sort of continuity between the Trump team and the Biden team on the Abrahamic Accords. And then the Biden team embraced it. The Biden team is trying to actually expand the Abrahamic Accords, is actually standing behind the Abrahamic Accords and trying to create a mechanism for the Accords through the Najaf Forum, which is some sort of a security architecture or a security centric grouping that discuss regional security and strategic issues. So I think the fact that India was at the beginning trying to navigate that, I think that makes a lot of sense. India is a major power in its own. So trying to understand and assess the evolving landscape, I think that made a lot of sense at the time. But right now, with the Abrahamic Accord being some sort of a framework, India is engaging. India is engaging in a much more in a minilateral format. meaning you have the I2U2, and then you have the France, UE, and India framework. And why is that? Part of it is this is the era of minilateral frameworks. The age of multilateral is a bit shaky. So right now, countries are looking for like-minded nations to cooperate with, trying to find common ground on strategic, political, economic issues. And this is what we are seeing. And Delhi is taking a leading position on that.
So, following it up on that, where does Saudi Arabia fit in the vision of Indo-Abrahamic Accords? I mean, it is not part of the accord per se officially, but I do see like Saudi Arabia being key to the whole vision of this grouping in the region, in the sense that Saudi Arabia is a good partner. In fact, perhaps the most reliable partner of UAE. It is also kind of easing its relationship with Israel. Now, Saudi has also doubled down on relationship with India in the last decade, and it is kind of hedging its relationships in terms of its dependency on China and the US for the long term by improving its relationship with India. So, where do you see Saudi fitting in this accord, in this equation?
Look, Saudi Arabia is on the rise, economically, politically, strategically. It's an indispensable power in the Arabian Gulf and beyond. First of all, remember this is the biggest nation in the Gulf. It's about 30 million people, so they have considerable demographics. In terms of wealth, they're extremely wealthy, but not only just wealth, it's not only about money. They are localizing industry, they're increasing their trade with the globe, they are reinvesting, doubling down on their infrastructure, from maritime to air transportation. They are going through generational change, and everyone is looking to Saudi Arabia as up and coming global power, not only limited to West Asia, by the virtue of all the things that we mentioned. It fits perfectly with the framework. Because Saudi rise means that policymakers in Riyadh will be looking into their own positioning differently than the last 70, 80 years in terms of multilaterals, minilaterals, bilateral relationships. However, it's going to take time, right? When it comes to relationships between nations that were consumed or constrained by historical narratives, it takes time to move away from that. And that's fine. And I think we should leave or give Saudi Arabia some time to figure out when and how and what they're going to do. In terms of the Saudi-India relationship, I think it's phenomenal. Again, India, third and fourth trade partners is the UAE around $72 billion, and then Saudi Arabia around $45 billion, and that number I expect might double in the next 10 years at least. Again, speaking about Indian expats in the Gulf, around 3.5 million Indians in the UAE. I think around 3 or 4 million Indians in Saudi Arabia. So in terms of in terms of Saudi-India relationship, actually very optimistic about it. I think our friends in Riyadh are very optimistic about it. They look into India as a partner, of choice. And they want to have interest-based relationship. And same thing applies to New Delhi too. They understand the potential of Saudi Arabia. They understand the value of Saudi Arabia. However, the timeline I think is going to be that question. And I think it's not going to be as fast as the UE in terms of normalizing or building relationship with other nations.
Okay, that's very intriguing. So let's then get to the Indo-Pacific. And my question would be that you're very well, uh, explained the case of Saudi Arabia when it comes to their relationship with India. And there's a country that interests me, which is Egypt. And why does it interest me is because countries like Egypt, countries like Israel, countries like Saudi, countries like, even Bahrain, Lebanon, uh, we've at least seen one thing, that when this Indo-Pacific concept has started emerging, at least certain countries in Europe, the United States and Canada, even our countries in the Far East have actually expressed certain understandings of what is the Indo-Pacific, what they wish to do, and so you may understand that I'm trying to bring you to I to you too. But when we look at West Asia, how countries like Egypt, how countries like Saudi Arabia, how do they, take the pivot of the Indo-Pacific? How do they understand it from a political overview?
Um, so it's a very important question, a very tricky question. Listen, a lot of countries, a lot of regional capitals understand that America doesn't have the same bandwidth, strategic bandwidth, meaning America historically, its own rise is based on Washington's ability to maintain multi theater dominance. That America can fight two wars in two different strategic theaters and win. And that's a reflection of the legacy of the Second World War. So you had America winning the war against Imperial Japan on the Pacific theater, and at the same time during the European offense against Nazi Germany and winning in the two theaters. So, and this is basically one of the major reasons for winning the war. And that doctrine dictated the U.S. foreign policy, dictated also perception of other countries about the United States' abilities and capabilities. That's changing, not because America is getting weaker. I don't think America is getting weaker at all in terms of military capacity. However, there's rise of the rest. There's other countries that are much more capable than before, on the rise strategically, economically, and politically. They want to take the lead on their own regional spaces. So the pivot from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific makes a lot of sense for Washington. You need to take away your assets, your strategic assets, reduce your military footprint in the Gulf and the Middle East broadly, and then pivot these strategic platforms to Taiwan, where America is trying to defend its positioning in the Indo-Pacific and Asia more generally. So in the Middle East, regional powers are thinking about what's a post US Middle East should look like. Remember, in the Middle East, there's no NATO, there's no Quad, there's no AUKUS. There was not, right? So they started to build new minilaterals that could fill some of the security gaps that will result from the US reduced footprint. So I think the first minilateral that started and people always underappreciated is the East Med Gas Forum, which is a Cairo-based forum that includes France, Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and that basically is a gas architecture that's trying to make sure that there is some sort of a security stability in this hotspot, especially with the Turkish-Greek competition. So that was the first minilateral in that broad region. And I think East Med definitely should be seen as part of West Asia. And then the second minilateral that we had is definitely the Abraham Accord, and then the Najaf Forum. So the Najaf Forum is Israel-based security forum that includes the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, the US, and Egypt, a country that normalized with Israel like in 1970s. And this sort of grouping is trying to also tackle or at least discuss regional security in general. And then the third one, in my own perception, is always the I2U2. Even though people are trying to make the I2U2 more about economics, I don't think it's just about economics. I think it's economics, but also strategic alignment and thinking collectively about security issues. So these are the three vehicles that started to emerge because of the reality that the United States is much more focused on the Indo-Pacific, and at the same time, also distracted by the war in Ukraine. Remember, I mean, America is the biggest backer of Ukraine. The reason why Ukraine is doing what it's doing right now, of course, the Ukrainian people. However, American support was very fundamental, very crucial in the war. So I think these three minilaterals in West Asia right now are trying to act as a way of to fill the gap that's being filled right now by regional powers.
Just to follow up on that, like while this is a vision of convergence where people can converge, countries can converge on a certain vision in the region, but when it comes to main contentions, especially like India and the rest in the Gulf, especially Iran and Pakistan. Now, how would the main Gulf countries that are traditional rivals of Iran would pursue the continued India's close relationship Iran, like historically it has been close with all the Muslim countries in the region, and it intends to continue to do so. Basically, it wants to have a good relationship with all the regions. So how would the uh, main rivals of Iran would pursue it, and how does India take uh, Gulf nations continued assistance to Pakistan? Like, I know many of these countries don't want to patronize Pakistan as they used to earlier, but still there is some kind of a uh, assistance keeps on going. Like we have recently seen the report saying that Saudi and UAE intends to bail out Pakistan from imminent debt crisis. That because Pakistan is going through a huge economic crisis. So how do you see these two major contentions working out? Because I do see in the I to U2 equation India being the main puzzle there, because rest of the three countries are mostly from the traditional US alliance axis. It's the India that brings the new dimension to the table. So how do you see these contentions working
No,
out?
it's a very interesting point and very, I really appreciate you for asking this question. I think in this moment of multipolar order, uh, uh, there's no grand bargain between nations, meaning you have to assess bilateral relationships based on their own merits. I mean, and this is what India is doing. I mean, literally, that country that's leading that track when it comes to pursuing multiple relationships with multiple rivals and saying, I only do relationships based on my own interest is India. And other countries are doing the same. And that's fine. Countries are okay with India pursuing its policy. At the same time, India should be comfortable with other countries pursuing their own policy. What matters is interest base, and that interest base is, I mean, it's trade, it's economics, it's people-to-people ties, it's technology, it's energy. I mean, if you share 70 or 80% of your foreign policy objectives, do you actually want to hurt that bilateral relationship and hold it hostage because X country has good relationship with X rival of India? I think this is not the way countries in the Gulf are thinking about it, and certainly not really policymakers in Delhi, right? I mean, the situation in Ukraine is very clear. It's like India and the Gulf and Israel are pursuing the same policy, regardless of their own relationship with the United States. You have Israel, you have the Gulf, you have India. They understand, they acknowledge the situation in Ukraine. They understand there's a party that did something wrong, for sure. However, they disagree on what's the response coming from the Western world, right? I mean, so I think this is the new norm, and people should be comfortable with that. But you cannot, in my advice, and this is my own policy recommendation, we cannot hold bilateral relationships hostage to historical narratives and the fact that countries have good relationship with X third party that might disagree with a country. I mean, I think that would make things much more complicated and will halt many of the improvements, many of the developments, many of the cooperation initiatives that are already taking place.
Right. So let's get to Europe and the Ukraine situation a bit, and let's understand certain aspects of, I would say, because there are instances wherein. So I would like to convert this question into 2 points. So the first aspect which I would like to ask is that after the Ukraine conflict, I think it will be in like the timeline would be like of a year in a few months, I guess, maybe by March. So we see a thing that uh, Middle Eastern countries, like you really rightly said, Israel, the Saudis, and others, they have taken a uh, very, I would say, nuanced approach to the situation. And the way the political hedging has been done by them and India individually as countries is a remarkable phenomena, because um, the Ukraine situation kind of also shows, because, for example, we had the energy situation in Europe for some time was not good, and Europe was considering to find alternative energy sources due to the situation with Russia and other things. So when it comes to energy economics and the way Europe has been trying to interact with West Asian countries, do you see how West Asian countries such as Israel, Egypt, and others have tried to uh, generate some space for their when it comes for themselves when it comes to their, I would say, trade relationship, energy economics, even I would say their political clarity. Because like you mentioned, there was a change of government in Israel just some time back after elections, and I'll not mention much about it, but I'll just say that Israel's position on Russia creatively changed a lot. Because I think the last dispensation before Netanyahu kind of was a bit rhetorical on Russia, but that actually has changed, which is natural to happen with a country like Israel. So, what do you think about when it comes to the Europe paradigm?
It's a very tough situation. It's very complicated. It's messy, and people here in Washington acknowledge that. They acknowledge it's a very tricky situation for a lot of reasons. Again, even the fact that Russia is not doing well in the Ukrainian theater, it doesn't mean that Russia is done as a global player that has interest and influence in many strategic theaters that are important to the countries that you have mentioned, from the East Med, the Mediterranean, to Middle East, West Asia, Levant, Gulf. I mean, they are a major player in Africa. They have good relationship with many Latin American countries, with many Asian countries. I mean, including India, based on energy, military ties, technology ties. So it's very hard to think about a complete isolation for Russia. The West is trying, succeeded to some extent on the tech side, on the financial side, but definitely will struggle with some of or many of the countries who have very strong interest that are aligned with Russia. That's very difficult to end. There's no incentive for example, there's there's zero interest for Israel to end security cooperation or at least security dialogue with Russia, given the fact that Russia is a major player in Syria, which is the northern borders of Israel. Doesn't work. Or other countries in the Mediterranean basin who have to interact with Russia because of the Black Sea and because of the Russian naval base in Syria. The same thing applies to other strategic theaters. Uh, so I think here in DC there is adjusted expectation. I think they understand that asking non-European actors to be as tough as European actors and the United States on Russia might be a maximalist position. And I think the last G20 was a bit humbling experience for Washington in terms of being exposed to the ideas of non-Western powers like India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, countries that are clearly have somehow different views about how to respond to the situation in Ukraine. Uh, these countries prefer dialogue, prefer negotiations, prefer different sorts of trajectory. And I think that's something that I started to see in DC recently in terms of the expectation they have from allies and partners outside of Europe.
Let's bring in the elephant in the room. Now, we have not discussed China till now, like what China means for the region, and given the discussion we had till now. Now, yes, in the I2U2, you can see India and US having a major common interest against China. Perhaps they would think that one of the ways of engaging with the region and balancing China's influence in the region is to go through I2U2 and other possible uh, frameworks in the future. But I do also see from the other side that Saudi and Israel and other countries don't want to get into this great power competition. They are like they want to be just good friends with everyone, and they don't want to jeopardize their vision, their own regional prosperity, ambition. So now you have discussed about messy situation regarding Ukraine. Now, how does this mess work out when it comes to China?
Bigger mess when it comes to China. Um, China is a major player. It's an economic player. It's a political player. Countries have strong trade relationships with China across the board, from Latin America to Africa to West Asia to Asian countries, everyone, including the United States. That's a fact. That's the fundamental foundation here. However, the political situation in Asia is very tricky, and countries are not blind to that. If Ukraine created that mess in terms of food security, energy security, financial meltdown, and a lot of countries are still trying to cope with the aftershock of the Ukraine war, specifically in the emerging markets. To think about how the situation, how the global map will be when you have a situation in Taiwan that's not really, that might be a bit difficult and different than the situation in Ukraine. And then you're going to have two major global conflicts taking place in the same place, in the same time. Uh, 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 you might try to dismiss great power competition, but great power competition will come home, knock on your door. That's the reality of things. Countries have the absolute moral right to think about their own people, their own national interests. Absolutely. However, they shouldn't be naive about the global landscape. When there is a war, there is a war. Wars change and alter global calculus, no matter what. I cannot really look into the future and tell you how the Ukraine situation, I'm sorry, how the Taiwan situation will alter the geopolitical relations between these countries and China. But definitely, I'm going to tell you that definitely is not going to be the same. Right? It's going to be different sort of costs, different sort of trade-offs. Let's think about it. When you have a situation in Taiwan, let's start with what's the position of India? That's important. The position of India will be very decisive in terms of energy supply lines, food security, and then what's the position of other Asian powers who also big importers and big trade partners to the Gulf states. I mean, I think the bilateral relationship across the Indo-Pacific are much more complicated and also not really China-centric still. I mean, we have the Gulf has very strong relationship with many of the Asian countries. So their calculus is not just China in terms of Taiwan situation. They have good relationship with Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, India. I mean, so their calculus would be a bit tricky in case of a Taiwan contingency in the future.
Just to follow it up, at the moment, which way is the balance tilted? Like region balancing relationship against China, or more like diversifying its dependence on US? Like which way is the balance tilted at the moment?
I always get that question, always, every time in every capital that I visit outside of the Gulf. Scholars, thinkers, policymakers always ask me that question: How should we think about China and the Middle East? I think my 2 cents are very clear. No one in the Gulf or in the Middle East is choosing China over the United States or choosing the United States over China. That's not really the equation that exists. The equation is very clear. China is a major player. We have already good economic and trade relationship. So having good relationship with China makes a lot of sense. And they only evaluated based on their own national interest. That's it. I think the problem is China became the elephant in the room, like you said. So there's a tendency to look into every single bilateral relationship from the length of great power competition between the United States and China. And I think that might be, I think, the wrong length to use while assessing some of the relationships that the Gulf Israel have with China.
So there's a country which I'd like to specifically discuss a bit before we get on, I would say, digital technologies and global governance. This country fascinates me because I think its relationship with a country called Greece is actually very interesting, and I am referring to Turkey. So, what has recently happened is that Turkey is kind of trying to reassess its situation in West Asia. We all have been aware of their positions on Israel, the Saudis, the relationship between the Saudis and the US. Obviously, Turkey is a part of NATO, so yes, they also have a kind of a relationship with the US very deeply and with Europe. But considering that the India-Turkey relationship has been quite, I would say, skewed, and it has its own value and it has its own, I would say, purpose. Um, how do we how should these Abraham Accord countries which have become a part with Israel should look? because I think that uh, we all understand that Saudi Arabia kind of endorses the Accords indirectly, because obviously, in a political sense, it is being conceived by thinkers that the Abraham Accords may lead sometime, maybe in decades or something, like to create an EU like situation wherein things are way better in the region. And Turkey is an interesting actor there. So Turkey's dynamics. I think I had this interview long back, months before. I think maybe a year ago, with Dr. Alvite, who's actually also in this area, and um, even he remarked the same, that Turkey's positions are becoming increasingly different. So how do you look at Turkey's dynamics per se? Because I think that fascinates a lot. Yeah.
Turkey is a powerful player by the virtue of its own geography, demographics, positioning, their economy. So they're a country on the rise, and they're a country that has influence and ability to alter the geopolitical landscape in multiple theaters at the same time. They are active in Libya, in North Africa. They're active in Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia. They're active in the Balkan. They're active in the Black Sea. They're active in Syria, in Iraq. I mean, they are basically in many strategic theaters, and this is very impressive for a country with its own size and demographics. Uh, and part of the fact that Turkey is a restless power, that Turkey is still trying to find its own strategic space, its own geography. The countries that are surrounding Turkey, from Syria, Iraq, Arabs, Iran, and then you have Armenia, you have Russia, and then you have the European countries, I think Bulgaria and Greece, the Greek islands. I think they're a country that's still trying to figure out what their own geostrategic space. And that leading Turkey to be restless, that's the term that I like to use, when it comes to the geopolitical landscape, right? Being in Libya, being in Syria, being in Iraq, being directly involved in the Nagorno-Karabakh. And I don't think that this will change, because I don't think that geopolitical realities around Turkey will change in terms of the statehoods, the countries, the nations. I think what I expect is going to happen after the Ukraine war is you have Russia is going to be on retreat because it's very consumed in terms of resources, demographics, military power in Ukraine for the next 10 to 15 years. And that will impact the Russian ability to maintain its own leading position in Central Asia, what we call the Turkish nations. And we have been seeing that in terms of the inability of Russia to alter the situation between Azerbaijan or Armenia, or stabilizing the situation between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So it reflect a Russian weakness. I think more likely Turkey will be able and much more positioned to fill that sort of a space in what we call post-Soviet space in Central Asia. I think this is where I see Turkey is more on the rise. In terms of how countries are reacting to Turkey, they're trying to deconflict. The Middle East in the last 10 years was very complex landscape of multi-layered competitions and conflicts between regional powers, in a way that at some point you were not really sure what countries are fighting for. So what you have been seeing in the last 2 years, some sort of tactical de-escalation, tactical deconfliction between Ankara and some of the Arab powers. Either Turkey, the UAE, they now they reset the relationship. Same thing applies to Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The Egypt-Turkey question is still tricky because they still have opposing views and positions on the East Med. I think this is the only theater where I think that might be we might have some sort of escalation in the future, but it's still less likely. It's still less likely, but it is, if there is some sort of escalation, it's going to be in this area.
Just a brief follow-up. How much of that Turkey equation is subject to Erdogan, or will it overlast Erdogan? Like, because we are looking at the report saying that maybe perhaps there is a chance of a leadership change. I mean, we don't know if that is for sure, but like, how much of it is like leadership neutral, basically?
I'm a geopolitical thinker. I'm a strategist, so I like to believe that everything is about geopolitics rather than individual figures. Meaning, do we expect change in Israel relationships with uh, India or the UE or the ITU2 participation because you have a transition of power between Yair Lapid to from Yair Lapid to Netanyahu? I don't think so. And I think the same model somehow applies to Turkey. Uh, the tone will change if there's some sort of political change in Ankara. I think the tone might change. I think the messaging might change. Hard for me to see that the hard for me to see a change in the political calculus in Ankara. That's a bit difficult for me to expect.
So let's get to the concluding part of this discussion, and I'd like to discuss about technologies and why is it so. We are seeing that countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and others are trying to create their own strategic space when it comes to emerging technologies. Now, we can take a soft and hard power context and say, okay, fine, there are defense technologies and then there are digital technologies. And while we can discuss about how entrepreneurs are flourishing in West Asia, they're partnering with us. We also have our startup people who actually have their own offices in Singapore, and I would say even Dubai, maybe even in Sharjah, I don't know. But there's a new groupthink which is emerging in West Asia for good, wherein so what happened was that in these 3 years when the pandemic was at its rampant level, the technological groupthink, which was very much, I would say, I would say American, Scandinavian, European, British, French. It's kind of more globalized. We also have Indian perspectives. We also have more Singaporean perspectives. It's not that they were not there, but we have also seen much more, I would say, not just strategic positions, but even strategic approaches. In like countries are literally interested to do something. We NEOM is one of the projects of Saudi Arabia in infrastructure and even in sustainability. But again, let us see how that grows. It's a very inspiring project. Let's see. But overall, I can't exactly remember the name of a very interesting forum. But the Saudis launched a multilateral forum, a kind of a grouping by some organization. I can't remember the name exactly, unfortunately. But my point is, West Asian countries, you in space tech, digital tech, they're trying to reinvent certain understandings of digital technologies, their ethics, their value when it comes to the economics of human life. How do you see it, like when it comes to, because I think even with India, this could become very sustainable, and it could chart new paths of cooperation. So yeah.
This is an excellent question. As someone who's trained engineer, and my first job after graduation from college was an engineer working for a big tech company, I'm always fascinated by the intersection of technology and national security and grand strategy. And in my capacity as the director of the tech program at the Middle East Institute, this is uh, the tech, the digital collaboration slash technology as a strategic theater is my biggest focus. Uh, I was invited to speak at the Global Cybersecurity Forum in Riyadh back in November. And it was fascinating to me to see a lot of Indian cybersecurity slash tech professionals there in Riyadh, including the Indian cyber czar who was also there in Riyadh at the time. And I think India and Saudi Arabia are about to sign an MIU, or they already signed an MIU on cyber cooperation. So cyber started to be a very like a cornerstone to many of these bilateral relationships. And the reason for that is countries, especially in West Asia, think about technology as a strategic space, as a sovereign space, as an indispensable element to sovereignty, state sovereignty, and statehood, and foreign policy. So countries want to be much more resilient on the tech front. I think thanks to the Trump administration campaign against Chinese 5G and Huawei, I think countries are thinking about technology differently. They're thinking about it as it's not really a luxury. It's not really a bunch of IT specialists sitting somewhere trying to handle network and do some sort of maintenance to a bunch of computers. I think they're thinking about it differently. Um, and is this sort of trend is going to emerge, is emerging already, and you are seeing a lot of countries are making tech and cyber a cornerstone to their own bilateral relationship. For instance, one of the major areas of cooperation between the UAE and Israel is cyber and tech, uh, drones design and manufacturing. You're speaking about cyber defenses, capacity building for Emirati professionals, discussing electrical vehicles, trying to co-invest. They're actually co-investing in India in the semiconductor industry. Still private sector. It's Israeli and Emirati venture capitalists who are investing in the semiconductor industry in India. But it gives you an idea that that sort of strategic space is becoming a much more like a cornerstone to many of these strategic alignments in the region. And part of it, another part of it, in my viewpoint, is they're trying to build a third way between China and the United States. Again, back to the original point, no one is choosing the United States over China, and no one wants to choose China over the United States. People want to prioritize their own national interests and their own national security. And to pursue your national security, you need to have your own technological slash cyber capabilities in this new era of global chaos. And I think India is seen as a cyber slash tech power. Part of it is that the Indian tech talent is very competitive, and countries recognize that. Countries also recognize the robustness of tech Indian tech companies and cyber companies, and also people appreciate the Indian norms when it comes to tech and cyber. So this is where I see India also able to leverage its own tech and cyber status to build or increase or develop or improve its own relationship with many of these powers in the region as well.
Just to follow it up on that, like given the fact that West Asia intends to diversify its own economic dependence on oil and energy and use these emerging technologies as a way to diversify its future economic path. Not that the traditional energy will become irrelevant, but it will perhaps, as a share of total energy consumption, reduce gradually. And I get West Asia is also trying to use technology as a way to diversify that. Now, as you have said, Indian tech manpower and Indian tech capabilities are a way to kind of perhaps do that. So, how does it work in the future institutionally? When I say institutionally, I mean, is there, I mean, I always see in the report saying that there is a free trade agreement between work on the works between GCC and India, but is it actually in that advanced level? Like, do you see any kind of a institutional agreement happening between India and the region where both can work more deeply institutionally, not like a issue by issue, sector by sector thing, but at a larger, broader level where technology plays a key role, and in fact, manpower exchange. Like Indian expats are already a big working community in the Gulf. Perhaps this will take it to even much advanced level where white collar share in the white collar workers will increase. So where do you see? We have also seen like to accommodate expats, the region is kind of mellowing down on its traditional conservative values on perhaps alcohol consumption or perhaps like the role of gender in the way the domestic economies work. We have seen Saudi prince leading the way in Saudi Arabia or UAE being more accommodative. I don't say liberal in the Western sense. I would use the word accommodative, where like gradually, according to the pace of their own societies, they are becoming more and more engaging with all these values. So the external workforce expats also kind of gel in with the vision of the West Asia. So the institutional framework, I want to seek your comments on.
Globally, we don't have an institutional framework for tech cooperation. I don't think so. I think what you are seeing is there is a proliferation of data agreements between tech powers. So you have the US, EU Tech Council, and then you have the cross-border data transfer, and then you have the EU India Tech Council. India and the United States are working on one. So that sort of many lateral tech alignment always start with you have to have an agreement on cross-border data transfer. That's it. But we don't really have something on the global level that actually able of formalizing cross-border data transfer. It's still subject to local companies, regional players, also to geopolitical tensions. And I'll be frank with you, when you think about it, it's very hard to think about a global platform that's able to address that right now, since we already have different versions of the internet exist in the same geographical space. I think what you might see is much or a fragmented version of the internet that emerge that include countries like India, countries of the EU, United States, and you can add to that Israel and Arab Gulf states. And this is because of the commercial interest on cross-border data transfer. I think Saudi Arabia launched an organization called Digital Cooperation Organization (DCO). I think one of the objectives that Saudi Arabia is trying to work on is they're trying to present their own agenda on data, and they are also trying to advocate for cross-border data transfer on a universal level. And I think the fact that Saudi Arabia is thinking about data and literally launching an organization to think about cross-border data transfer is also tells you where Saudi Arabia is and where they want to be in the long term.
Like, do you envisage any kind of trade agreement happening where things on different sectors can be at more easy level without all these specific agreements?
I know that the UAE and the United States just signed a cross-border data transfer agreement last year, I think either October or November. And I think this is like the first time we hear about a Gulf nation having a data framework with the United States. And I think that agreement between the UAE and the US will be replicated with other Gulf countries. And I think this is a very, very positive. It was long overdue to have that sort of agreement.
So, as we are at the conclusion of this talk, I would say that it was a pleasure to host you, and I think we covered so many interesting areas from West Asia to technology governance, and I think maybe in future also, if anything turns up which would be intriguing to discuss, I think we'd be happy to have you.
No, thanks so much. Really appreciated the back and forth, the conversation. Really appreciate the work you do. It's always a pleasure to engage with intellectuals from India. And again, really appreciate it. I really appreciate that you are talking to me while it's nighttime in India. So please, I'm sending my regards to your Indian followers, and I hope I can be on the podcast in the future.
Sure. It was a pleasure to have, and surely I think we'll be next time.